Now we come to a time in which we pause to meditate upon the meaning of the various elements of this Lord's Supper that we are about to partake of. Today, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, we are going to be focusing upon the cup, why we drink the cup and how we drink the cup. Let's have a prayer of preparation, please. Lord, help us now to understand more clearly this cup and why we drink of it and how we are to drink of it. Enable us to understand the role of sufferings in our life. Help us to understand that through them your glory is made known in us. For we pray it in Christ's name. Amen. Every time we come to Communion Sunday, of course, I'm reminded of all the times that I have celebrated communion over the last 40 years with people in all kinds of places, all around Texas especially, and here and now in Ecuador and other areas as well. And as I remember all those different communions, I think about different experiences that I had. And there was one that has kind of always stood in my mind, kind of a funny one. But when I was associate pastor of a very large church, in that church, because we had so many hundreds and hundreds of people, we had a huge chancel rail altar with all the little cups and the bread and everything all set up. And people would come in large numbers and kneel at the altar, and we would distribute the elements, and then they would go back and sit down, and then others would come, and that's how we got 3,000 or 4,000 people to take communion on one Sunday. And there was a young woman there that was very faithful and loyal to our church, and she always came for communion, and she loved to bring her 2-year-old daughter with her. And of course, she didn't want to leave the little 2-year-old sitting by herself in the pews, so she would bring the little 2-year-old up to the altar with her. Now, this little 2-year-old had tasted the grape juice and really loved the grape juice. And every time she would bring him up to the altar, we all got used to her doing this, but she would take the little girl up to the altar and begin to kneel down to get the elements. And the little girl would always point at the cup and go, "Welchie, Welchie, Welchie." She wanted a drink of the Welch's grape juice as well. She loved the taste. And, in Christianity, we really would hope that people would have that kind of a desire to drink this cup. Not because it's good, tasty, sweet grape juice, but because of what it really means. But the problem is, in our Christian life, is that many people don't even understand what this cup is about. And once they do understand what it's about, it's like, well, maybe I don't want to drink that cup anymore. Because this cup is the cup that Jesus drank. Now, this is part of our series on the questions that Jesus asked. And the question he asked the sons of Levi that day when the mother came to ask for special privileges for them. He asked that question, and he asked it for us today as well. Can you drink the cup that I am going to drink? That's the question he asked. Can you drink it? And that means you need to know what it is first before you say, oh yeah, I can drink it, not a problem. Because this cup represents everything you have ever suffered in life, or also everything you will suffer in life. This cup is the cup of suffering that Jesus drank before he was crucified wrongly, unjustly, and in a horrible way. And that's why on that night that he was betrayed and he had this meal and he lifted up the cup, after he had given thanks for it, he told his disciples to drink it because this represented the new covenant that they needed to understand. And what is that new covenant? Part of that new covenant is the idea that our sufferings have a real important role to play in our life. Jesus understood, though he didn't want to suffer the death that he was going to suffer on the cross, and actually prayed for the Father to take away this cup. But nonetheless, if this is what I must suffer, then your will be done. You see, indicating that this is the nature of suffering in our life. Nobody wants to suffer, and rightly so. Who really wants to suffer? Nobody does. But the faith we have, the Christian faith, teaches us that it is better to rejoice in our sufferings than it is to run from them, hide from them, hate them, become rebellious because of them. Instead, we need to embrace our sufferings. But the question is, can you do that? Can you embrace your sufferings? And the only way you can do it is if you have faith that through them, God is going to do something in your life that will make you even more amazingly like Christ than you were before. You see, that's the goal that we're headed toward, is trying to become more like Jesus, more like Christ, more like God. How are we going to do that? Unless we go through sufferings. And again, it's not that we want to do it, but that we know that if we do it, we shall be made more like Christ. And so that is the point of this cup here today, and that's why Jesus was asking us the question, and is still asking us the question, can you likewise drink this cup and rejoice? Can you do that? Can you likewise accept the sufferings in your life as God's way of making you more like God? Not as a punishment, but as a wake-up call as to how you need to be. So, this then is the cup of suffering. And if we are to understand it clearly, we must understand that what this meal is doing is asking us once a month at least, if not as often as we can, to remind ourselves that life is suffering. It happens all the time. No telling what kind of misery is going to come upon you. It just happens that way. Try to run, but you cannot hide. And that suffering comes upon you. What are you going to do? Are you going to remember that you drank the cup down at ICC on Sunday? And therefore said, I'm ready to accept, not like, not appreciate in that sense, no. But I'm ready to accept whatever suffering I must accept in order to become more like Christ. That's the understanding we need to have. So I said, let me think about people that I have known over the years that I have shared communion with, and share their story with you a little about how it changed their life when they began to understand the scriptures that tell us that suffering is to be rejoiced in, the idea that Jesus wants us to drink the cup of suffering so we can become like Him. And I thought if I shared a few of those stories with you today as we meditate upon this meal, you'll have a deeper and greater appreciation for the idea of rejoicing in your sufferings. Drink them in, and believe that they will make you more like Christ than you have been before. The first one that comes to my mind was a really tremendous woman that I got to know when I was pastor in a little town called Elgin, Texas. I was the senior pastor there for 4 years actually. And she was a faithful member of our church. She was an African-American woman, and she was about, at the time I was there, she was about 102 years old. And of course she was in a wheelchair, but she got to church every Sunday she was there. And she had no teeth left except one tooth. It was like if one tooth was there still. She didn't have any false teeth, probably couldn't afford them. But she would smile with that one tooth. And she had such a great spirit about her. She was truly a gentle, humble soul. And she inspired a lot of us. And I shared communion with her many, many times. And one day we had some opportunity for people to bear witness to their faith and how they handled the sufferings in their life. And somebody on the council said to me, well, why don't you invite, her name was Aunt Esther, that's what we called her. Aunt Esther said, why don't you invite Aunt Esther to give us a little witness about how she has survived 102 or 3 years and all the suffering she's gone through. So I said, yeah, that sounds great. So I had invited her to come and say a word or two to the congregation. And she talked about all the different things that she had seen in her life. This was in the 1970s, so she had grown up in the 1870s. And so you can begin to imagine what all she had seen since that time. But she talked about the different hard times, the Depression, World War I, different things, and how she experienced those and how she kept going and believing and trusting in God and all of those things. that God would bring every bad thing to a good end. That was what she was sharing about it. And that was her faith, and that she felt like sufferings made her faith stronger. And she said, I have a saying about sufferings, and I remember it to this day. When you saw her with her little one tooth and her smile and her little wheelchair, and she said, here's how I deal with suffering. She said, I meets it, then I greets it, then I defeats it. And I said to myself, that's the Christian spirit, you see. That's how you drink the cup of suffering. You meet it, you greet it, and you defeat it. In faith that God will make that suffering into a cause for you to be more like Him. So that was Aunt Esther, and I remember her really well. And then there was a young man named Lawrence that I remember back when I was a youth pastor in another large church. And of course, we were a suburban church, and we were pretty much all white folks. I would say, yeah. But there was a family that joined us, an African-American family that joined with us. And their oldest son was named Lawrence. And Lawrence became part of our youth group, and I got to know him really well. And he was a tremendous young man. Had faith way, way beyond his years. Had a beautiful smile, tall, handsome young man. And he was really loved by all the young people in our group. And he went with us wherever we went, and he worked with us as a youth ministry. And he had a great sense of humor about the fact that he was the only African American in this 250 group of young white people. And he had such a good spirit about him. I remember one day we were selling suntan lotion to raise money for a mission. And we'd send everybody out 2 by 2 to knock on doors. And of course, Texas, you probably need a little suntan lotion. And so we were selling the suntan lotion door to door. And of course, he was African American. And he took it with such a sense of humor. It was great. When he would knock on the door and they'd go through their little speech about what a great suntan lotion it was, he had a big old smile and he says, yeah, look what it did for me. And it was just, he had a great, great spirit about it. But once we had a time in which, again, a person could share about their faith, and somebody invited him to be a part of that sharing, and the question was asked, in those days, back in the 1970s, there was lots of trouble between black folks and white folks, and people were upset with each other and yelling and ranting and raving, and we had all kinds of racial difficulties in those days, not like today. But nonetheless, and they asked him to share how did he and his family decide to come to this all-white church out in the middle of suburbia. And he shared something that afternoon that was really great. He said, you know, I looked at it, and the white people in those days, they hated the black people because they were black. He says, but I looked at it more closely, and I realized that the black people, they hated the white people because they were white. So both groups were hating each other. And he said, I thought it would be better if we just loved each other. Now, he was about a 16-year-old kid when he said that. And it just, you could hear a pin drop throughout the whole room. Because it was absolutely true. This suffering, this horrible difficulty we were having as getting along and upset with each other, and the prejudices and the things that he had to endure as a black person, all of that had led him to the conclusion that instead of being on one side or the other, you needed to rise above that and just love people, regardless of where they were coming from or what they were like or whatever. And that was the message. So what he was able to show all those young people that afternoon was that suffering can make you see a greater truth. Not only does it give you a greater faith, but this cup of suffering, if you drink it, if you begin to suffer the things that go on in your life and happen in your life, it will open your eyes to see what you need to see about the world in which you live. You see, if you hide out someplace and avoid seeing anything and don't know anything about anything, then you're never going to change. You're never going to grow because you don't see the real truth of the situation. But when you drink that cup of suffering, when you get involved in it, whether you wanted to or not wanted to, you begin to see the truth about the reality in which we live. So that was another memory that came to my mind, was the memory of Lawrence and the fact that he understood that the suffering he had suffered, the prejudices that he had endured and all that, helped him to understand that that's not the answer, being prejudiced, being judgmental, being condemning. The answer is to love others, regardless of who they are, what skin color they might have. And then another person that I will remember very well, I've shared this before. When I was in seminary, I was tasked with going to do ministry on the Navajo reservation in northern Arizona. I spent about 3 months out there living with the Navajo Indians and understanding their culture and helping them to grow in their Christian faith. And they were very excited to understand what Christianity was about. It was a great experience for me. But there was a young boy there that I got to know pretty well. His name was Dakota. Dakota was I think he was about 13 or 14 years old when I was out there. And he was very much engaged in learning about what they called the Great Spirit, which of course was their understanding of who God was. And he was very sincere about it. And he would read the scriptures and ask me questions about it. And I got to know him quite well. Very poor little family he came from, as most of the Navajos in that area, very poor. And yet he had this kind of joy about his life. And as it came to pass, someone in the village or somebody, I can't remember who did it, but someone gave him this little dog. It could be his pet. And Dakota just loved that little dog, and the little dog loved Dakota. And it was the best thing that ever happened to him. He just couldn't believe that he had been so blessed by God to have this little dog. Well, there were some teenagers from the main town nearby, Tuba, Arizona. And they were white, of course, and they loved to give these Navajo kids trouble. That for some reason they just loved to drive in their fancy sport cars and laugh at them and throw rocks at them. And it was a horrible thing that they were doing, and not right at all. And one day they had come in to make trouble for the young Navajos that were playing out in this dirt field or whatever. And as they left, they sped off, and the little dog ran out in front of the car and got killed by these horrible young teenagers doing this horrible thing to the Navajo. And Dakota was just heartbroken. You know, his little dog died. And I tried to counsel him, comfort him, and lift him up. And he was crying about it. And he gave a witness to me privately that has stuck with me ever since. And in his tears, he said, you know, I'm so poor. All we have is dirt and a dirt house. And I even eat dirt in my beans. And that little dog was the only thing I had that was important to me. And he said, now he's gone. And then he said, but I guess God has something better for me. What a tremendous, tremendous witness it was. In his poverty, in the loss of his only thing that he treasured, he was able to say, through this I have a greater hope that God will give me something even greater than what I had before. He had listened well to the lessons and read the scriptures well for his age. And so that was another one of the young people or persons that I had communion with. And it reminded me that sufferings do take away a lot of the things that are important to us. We lose a lot of things, you know. We lose loved ones that die, or they get hurt, or they have an accident. We lose possessions. We lose all kinds of stuff. And there's a lot of suffering and grief in this world. And when that grief comes upon you, you have a choice. You can either drink the cup or you can run away. And Jesus says, drink the cup. You got to drink it. Yeah, it's a loss. Yeah, it's something that hurts. Yeah, it's something that's going to be tough to get over. But let me tell you, Jesus basically says, let me tell you, you drink this cup, you will be made more like Christ. You will be made more new than you are now. It will be for your blessing and your benefit. Sure, it hurts now. Sure, it's horrible now. But understand The way you face suffering as a Christian is you believe that God is going to give you something even better than what you have lost. You see? That's why we drink this cup. Because when we drink it, it reminds us, that's what I need to believe. And so that's what we try to do. Well, again, the meditation is based upon the question, can you drink this cup? And of course we invite you to come here today and drink this cup. But it's not just to drink it with no understanding in your head or in your heart. It is to drink it with understanding. And it is to drink it with a feeling of gratitude and a feeling of rejoicing that through your sufferings, God will give you greater faith. God will show you a deeper truth. And God will give you a greater hope than what you ever had before. So you are invited in a few minutes to come and partake of this cup. But first we must sing our hymn about filling up our cup and understand that that has to do with suffering.